You're listening to Fire Ecology Chats, a podcast series by the Association for Fire Ecology.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Bob Keane. I am the editor-in-chief of the internationally renowned journal Fire Ecology. Fire Ecology is a journal that's overseen by the Association for Fire Ecology, or AFI, and published by Springer Nature. I want to welcome you all here today. We're going to be talking about a wicked cool paper. The title of that paper is Power and Planning, a critical discourse analysis of tribal and non-tribal Oregon wildfire protection plans. And we have the senior author here to talk about it, Christian Heisler. Christian, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi Bob. Thanks for having me. My name's Christian Heisler. I'm a PhD candidate at Portland State University going into my fifth year. I'm an environmental social scientist where I mostly study discursive constructions of land and wildfire. And what that means basically is how do we culturally create meaning out of wildfire and the environment, and whose agendas and cultural interests and values and political interests do those environmental narratives serve?
Well, welcome aboard the Fire Ecology train and welcome to Fire Ecology Chats. So, Christian, why don't you give the background on this paper?
When I first arrived at PSU, I got assigned to work on a project where we did a social network analysis of wildfire practitioners within a few different regions, one being in Central Oregon and one being in Western Wyoming. And one of the findings that stuck out from that study, as well as some previous studies of a similar nature, was that in these networks of practitioners, we mapped their connections to each other and found which practitioners were most central to those networks. And what we consistently found was that tribal folks or tribal representatives within the fire world were almost consistently on the fringes of those networks. And maybe there are some more obvious reasons for why that is concerning capacity and things like that. But we wanted to thoughtfully engage a little bit more with why we found that so consistently and to kind of interrogate this collaborative relationship that tribes often have with the federal government, federal agencies who are involved with land management and those kinds of things. So that's kind of how I got put on this train of looking at relationships between tribes and non-tribal agencies in the realm of wildfire planning.
Well, as I read the paper, I found the methods really, really interesting. Could you give us a little summary of what methods you use for the study?
Yeah, definitely. So we do what's called a critical discourse analysis, and that's basically just a fancy way of saying language analysis. So looking at how things are written and asking critical questions about what narratives are being told here, what cultural values are being represented within these stories and these words and this language, which was a bit tricky to apply to more technical documents like wildfire protection plans. But when we say critical, when we're talking about critical discourse analysis, we're not necessarily being critical of the authors, but more so being critical of the institutional narratives that normalize the colonization of Native people and the dispossession of their lands. So what we're trying to do in a nutshell is unearth harmful narratives that have become natural to us. We're all complicit in this in one way or another. So it's less of a moral issue with people who have written these plans and more so a systemic problem where our historical view has become warped by certain narratives. So what our goal is to kind of unearth those narratives and show that these narratives are connected to an ideology. The narrative isn't necessarily the truth, it's just a version of the truth that might reflect one culture's priorities over another. So to take those institutionalized narratives and show that there are pros and cons to using this kind of narrative and just situate them within the broader historical context in which they've emerged.
Very interesting methods. A very important point in the paper is how you did that. So, can we get a quick peek at the results, Christian?
Of course, of course. You know, a lot of the narratives within both tribal and non-tribal plans were more similar than different, but as critical researchers, we're looking for the differences. And there were some notable differences between them. So non-native plans tended to tell a story about wildfire that was a lot more historically vacant and antagonistic toward fire, whereas native plans were telling a story that was much more nuanced about regional history and the role of fire in forests. So something interesting about that is we're working on a follow-up study right now involving interviews of these authors to kind of understand how the sausage is made, so to speak, to understand the process of how these plans are created, to understand why some plans might include a very detailed history of fire suppression and colonization and indigenous removal, whereas other plans might just say, yeah, here are fires that have happened in the past 20 years. How do those narratives actually get put in these plans is what we're trying to kind of understand with this follow-up study. And what we've learned so far is is that these contextual sections, these sections where a county is defining its history and its demographics and things like that, what we're hearing is that these sections are more of an afterthought. They're not even really given that much thought or consideration. A lot more of the attention is going toward the more actionable details. But what that tells us is, not that these planners are trying to protect the colonial empire by spinning these narratives that erase tribal history, but it's something much broader than that. What we're finding here then is that the default historical narrative that makes it into these plans, the narrative that's often pulled from another plan or something like that because it's not getting much attention, is one that makes no mention of Native people, makes no mention of their histories, makes no mention of their influence on fire environments. It doesn't mention that there used to be a different fire regime in the western US where forests were frequently burned by people. It doesn't mention that Native people were removed, disrupting that regime of burning. It doesn't mention that the implementation of wildfire suppression was kind of the mechanism for removing Native influence, and that wildfire suppression has, in large part, gotten us into the dilemma that we're facing today. And I think something that people might think is, why focus on the history when there's work to do right now? There's a lot of pressing fire work to do, and that's absolutely true. But what I want to encourage readers to reflect on as they're reading this paper is the short-term thinking that has gotten us into the mess that we're in right now. I think we're going to need long-term thinking to dig ourselves out of this hole that we've created with the wildfire dilemma, and engaging with our history is a critical part of doing that. So we're really trying to emphasize critical awareness of how our historical narratives have led us to this current moment.
Yeah, I totally agree. Without that historical perspective, we'll never be able to effectively solve the fire dilemma that we have on the landscape.
Mhm.
And obviously, this particular paper has huge implications for fire management, both on and off tribal lands. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of ways that our results can be used by management or scientists, but basically I have two answers for how our results can be used. One is more abstracted and one is more concrete. So I'll start with the abstracted answer, which is generally our goal is to encourage planners, managers, academics to reflect on the stories and assumptions that are guiding their work. And I think this could be applied to any industry, beyond fire, beyond the environment. Where are your narratives coming from and how are they guiding your work? And then looking for those narratives that may be unhelpful or harmful to a certain community and being critical of those. So uprooting colonial narratives from institutional practices wherever possible. Under every decision is an ideology. So what is that ideology that's guiding the work? And we have power in our institutions. As members of organizations and as members of our society, we have power. So how can we use that power to create a world that we would like to see? And recognizing that our stories that we tell ourselves and that we tell others are a big part of that. So critically engaging with those stories. And then the more concrete answer is to, if you're involved in the wildfire planning world, in the management world, is basically just to share power with tribes wherever possible. An easy way to describe it would be land back, which is something that is more possible in some areas than others, but wherever possible, share that power with tribes. Find ways to delegate authority to tribes. If you're lucky enough to collaborate with a tribe in any way, familiarize yourself with their values and their priorities. Make space for non-Western ideas and stories about the environment and how we should do things. Be an advocate for treaty rights when tribes aren't in the room. The more familiar you are with tribal priorities, the better you're going to be able to be a champion for those priorities when tribes aren't in the room. And the reality is many tribes are facing capacity concerns, so they're not always able to be in the room. Trying to be creative, find new ways to allocate power to the tribes, and then write about it. Write about it and share those ideas so that other people have access to the same kinds of mechanisms and can try implementing it in their neck of the woods. So yeah, that's just kind of a short list of things that could hopefully be taken from this research.
Well, Christian, thank you for a wonderful paper and a great study. You want to recognize any co-authors or funding agencies?
Yeah, definitely. So I want to take a minute to recognize my co-authors who can't be here today. My advisor is Max Nielsen Pincus, and he's really great. He's helped a lot with this. There's also Doug Durr, who is an anthropologist who's done a lot of really great work around Oregon and elsewhere. And then Gabe Shioships, who is the executive director at Friends of Tryon Creek, where he's doing a lot of really cool cultural restoration and environmental restoration within Portland city limits. So yeah, I just want to recognize them because they all were super helpful in getting this paper off the ground.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Christian, for coming and joining us today and talking about your paper. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Appreciate you having me.
And everyone, all you listeners, if this interests you at all, why don't you go to our website, the journal website, Fire Ecology and Springer, and download this paper? Because guess what? Kristen and his co-authors have already paid the fee for you to download that paper for free. So you can download it and read all about this wonderful study. And until then, why don't you join us again for the next Fire Ecology Chats?
Thank you for listening to Fire Ecology Chats, a podcast series by the Association for Fire Ecology. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to our show and leave us a review. To learn more about fire ecology and support our future work by becoming a member, visit fireecology.org. FIREECOLOGY.org.